Hi, welcome to Pyrography Made Easy. I'm Brenda. In this episode, I am going to show you how I created my Ford Buick artwork. This is a long tutorial. In fact, I think it's the longest one I've ever made. But there were a number of things that needed to be covered. To make it easier for you, I do have everything broken into chapters, so you can easily find the section that you're most interested in. Also, the pattern and the reference photo for this artwork are available on my Etsy page, and I will put a link to that in the video description. Well, let's get started. The first thing to work on is the cast shadow on the ground. I've got my shader in optimal position as I burn along the edges of the shadow. Optimal position means that the tip or front edge or toe of the shader is on the outer edge of the shadow. The body of the shader is angled over the shadow. This will help ensure that the outer edges of the shadow are crisp and clean. Make sure to rotate the board as needed so that it is easier to burn along the outer edges. Another reason to rotate the board is to keep the pen tip in optimal position. I like to burn along the edges of an object, creating a thick band, and then I fill in the object. The thick band means that I don't have to burn all the way to the outer edge. It's already been done, and it helps me fill in areas quicker. Begin by burning over the trace lines. Keep the color in the light to medium tan range. I am using a small shader for this, but you can also use a writer nib. Rotate the board as needed so that your pen tip is in optimal position and burn a dark line on the car body adjacent to the fender. This will help clearly define the upper edge of the bumper. Next, burn in the dark tree reflections. I am using a small shader for this, but a writer nib or a ball tip are good alternatives. I am holding the pen at a steep angle, so very little of the metal is in contact with the board. Essentially, I am burning with the razor edge or the side of the shader. This produces a very thin line. I'm not burning at a high heat. To get a dark result, I have to slow down my hand speed and reburn over areas several times. This slow approach provides a lot more control over the final results, and fewer mistakes tend to be made. If you closely examine the bumper, you will hopefully notice that there are 4 colors. First, we have white, or the reflected light. That'll be represented by unburned wood, or paper in my case. Then we have black or very dark brown from reflected scenery. There is also a dark tan along the top and what I would call a light brown along the front. Each color has its own defined area, and for the most part, each area is clearly defined. I start with the dark areas first. There are not very many, and the largest ones are found on the left end of the bumper. I have switched pen tips, and now I am using a micro writer. This makes it easier to burn in the fine details on the bumper, especially since my artwork is not very large. For the most part, I am burning single lines, but I also use circular motion on the larger dark areas. Keep in mind that larger is a relative term since none of the dark areas are really that big. As you can see, I am reburning over areas several times to build up the color. What you can't see are the numerous times that I stop burning to check with the reference photo. I do this to double check which pattern lines represent the dark ones on the reference photo. I highly recommend that you do the same thing. Once the black markings are done, or mostly done, use a shader and burn in the light brown areas on the front of the bumper. For this, I am using either circular motion or uniform strokes as my burn method. The bumper is reflecting the concrete road below it, and the concrete has quite a bit of texture. So the burns on the bumper do not need to be perfectly smooth. Up close, my bumper in the artwork has a touch more texture than I like, but a lot of that is due to the watercolor paper. I'm not burning at a high heat. Instead, I use a lower heat and reburn to build up the color. This gives me a lot more control over the final results. Not only do I burn at lower heats, but I also use a very light hand pressure when burning. The nib just touches the surface, so it can easily glide over the surface of the board. A light hand pressure also ensures that the nib maintains constant heat, so my burn results are consistent in color. I have a video that goes into great detail on how hand pressure impacts your burn results. I will put a link to that tutorial in the video description. I don't think there is anything more I can tell you about burning in the different colored sections on the front bumper. That said, let's jump forward to the spot where the sun reflects on the bumper. I circled the spot on the inset photo. The reflected sun is bright, so we replicate this by burning around that reflection. Or to put it another way, we don't burn over the sun's reflection. Instead, we darken the area adjacent to the sun's reflection to create the needed contrast so that it looks bright. The darker the adjacent area is, the brighter the sun's reflection will appear. I kept my reflection toned down because it's not the focal point, but it is completely up to you how bright you want your sun reflection to be on the bumper. The decorative accent on the bumper gets handled just like the rest of the bumper with two exceptions, and I will cover those in a little bit. Begin by defining the outer edges of the dark reflections. I am using a micro writer nib for this. Then I switched to a standard writer nib to burn in the dark reflections. I'm not sure why, because the micro writer was much easier to use in this small area. Mostly, I am using circular motion as my burn stroke, but I do use some uniform strokes. The area circled in red on the reference photo is one of the differences I spoke about earlier. I deliberately burned this area to a light brown color instead of black so that it would stand out from the car fender. It's up to you if you want to do the same thing. Here is the second difference between the accent and the bumper. I'm using an embossing tool to firmly rub over the 3 white lines found on both sides of the accent. Make sure the lines are deeply embossed into the surface of the wood. Then use a shader and burn over the area. As the color gets darker, the lines will become visible. Other than the embossed lines and the color change, there isn't anything uniquely different on the accent. So finish burning it using the same techniques that we did on the rest of the fender. The accent has the same 4 colors that the rest of the bumper has, and each color has defined edges. I burn in each color using either uniform strokes or circular motion as my burn method. I do want to point out, if you compare my artwork with the reference photo, you can see I did not make an exact replica of the photo. That's okay. No one except you is going to be comparing my artwork with the reference photo. Here's a comparison of the reference photo with my artwork. The first thing to do is burn in the cast shadow on the tire. There isn't anything special about this area. It just needs to be a very dark brown to black color. Use the burn stroke you prefer. I used uniform strokes and some circular motion for this. But again, it doesn't matter. All you want is for the color to be really dark. The shadow extends the length of the fender, but the super dark part narrows along the top of the tire. We're also going to burn in the area behind the tire to a dark color. This area is part cast shadow and part car, but I couldn't tell the two apart. Once that is done, then burn adjacent to the transition zone on the side of the tire. This is where the side of the tire begins to curve towards the tire tread. An arrow is pointing to the spot. Next, darken up the tire sidewall and burn in the cast shadow under the tire. The cast shadow should be a dark color that matches the color of the bumper's cast shadow. Rotate the board when burning along the outer edge of the cast shadow. You want the front or toe of the shader to be on that edge. The body of the shader should be angled over the tire, not the background. This will keep the edge of the shadow crisp and clean. The same rule applies when burning adjacent to the white wall on the tire. You want the toe of the shader on that edge and the body angled over the dark part of the tire. The tire sidewall is darker adjacent to the white wall portion of the tire, and it gets a shade or two lighter as you get near the transition zone. My sidewall is pretty dark, and it's hard to tell the tire from the cast shadow. It is up to you if you want to do the same or if you want to have more color differentiation between the two. I am not burning at a high heat, so I have to reburn to build up the color. I am primarily using uniform strokes as my burn method, but occasionally I do use some circular motion. There is a curved cast shadow on the upper portion of the white wall. Burn this shadow to a dark tan or light brown color. I am mostly using circular motion as my burn method, but I also use some uniform strokes. Do your best to burn the shadow to a uniform color. The color on my shadow is not very uniform, and there are two reasons for this. One, I primarily used circular motion as my burn method. For some reason, I get bored burning uniform strokes. And two, I'm burning on watercolor paper. Watercolor paper is tougher to burn on than wood, but if the watercolor paper is acid-free, the artwork isn't prone to fading like it does on wood. After the cast shadow is burned in, then burn over the rest of the white wall tire. Burn the white wall to a medium tan color. This color should be a couple of shades darker than what my artwork is. My artwork is a light tan, maybe even very light tan in color. The problem with that is that it is too pale. There is a lot of dark color adjacent to it, and this creates an area of high contrast. This high contrast draws the eye away from the focal point. The focal point is the grille and the headlights. So make sure you burn your white wall tire a couple of shades darker than what I did. Use the shader of your choice and burn along the bottom edge of the tire tread. The color should be darkest at the very bottom and get gradually lighter a short distance from that bottom edge. I started out using pull-away strokes to give the area some gradient color. Then I switched to circular motion as I darkened the area up. In some areas, I used uniform strokes. Keep in mind, you can use any burn stroke you want. The color on the tire tread does not need to be uniform. In fact, some color variation would be preferable, as it will help give the tire some texture. Use the edge of a shader or a writer nib and burn over the left tread pattern lines. Make sure to angle the line slightly upward when burning on the side of the tire. An arrow is pointing to the area I am referring to. Next, burn over the leftmost tire tread. Use whatever burn stroke you prefer. I am primarily using circular motion. As I use this burn stroke, I am making a point of creating irregular color to help create texture on the tire. Also, I avoid burning over the reflected light on the transition zone. The transition zone is found between the side of the tire and the tire tread. An arrow is pointing to it. I am using an embossing tool to create deeply embedded dots and lines on the board. These embedded dots and lines will become the highlights found on the reference photo. An arrow is pointing to one. If you have a Dremel or other rotary tool, you can create the highlights after you're done burning. You can also use an X-Acto knife to scrape in the highlights after you're done burning. Since I'm burning on watercolor paper, I'm using the embossing method. This ensures I don't create a hole in the paper. Resume burning over the tire tread. Make sure to use the flat of the shader when burning over the embossed lines. This will prevent the nib from sinking down into the embossed lines. I am using either circular motion or uniform strokes as my burn method. When I use the uniform strokes, I tend to avoid burning over the embossed lines. If anything, I burn adjacent to the embossed lines to help them stand out. As you can see, the color on my tire tread is not uniform. Also, my artwork is much lighter in tonal value than the reference photo. Personally, I like how my tire turned out. But if you would prefer that your artwork look something closer to the reference photo, then burn the tire tread a number of shades darker than what I did. Just keep it lighter in value than the cast shadow. Burn over the transition zone. I'm using circular motion as my burn stroke to create irregular color and give the area a base layer of color. Afterwards, I begin the reburning process. The goal is to soften the line that formed on the tire sidewall. I'm not sure why I burned the tire this way, but at least it's something that can be fixed. One of the main ways I soften that line is by burning circular motion over the line. Also, I slow down my hand speed to get darker burn results. And lastly, I keep reburning over the area until the color is as dark as I want it to be and the line is no longer visible. Use the edge of a shader or a writer nib and burn a dark thin line around the outer edge of the hubcap. Then burn a dark thin line on the inner edge of the dark ring that circles the hubcap. If needed, you can very gently scrape away overburn and mistakes with the edge of a sharp knife. You can also restore highlights this way. The hubcap is very similar to the front bumper in that it has 4 colors that create the look. First, there is white or unburned wood. Then we have tan, dark tan to maybe light brown, and then a very dark brown or black color. Burn in the shapes that are dark brown or black colored first. I like to first define the edges of a shape and then I fill that shape in with color. I am using either circular motion or uniform strokes as my burn method, but quite truthfully, these dark areas don't matter. You're not going to be able to see individual burn strokes. Don't worry about replicating every minute detail on the hubcap. No one is going to pay that much attention to it. If you capture the major details, it will look wonderful. I continue to reburn to build up the color on the dark areas. Reburning usually takes longer to do versus increasing the heat on the burner. On the flip side, I find that fewer mistakes are made, so time isn't wasted on fixing problems. The lower portion of the hubcap has a lot more going on. I find it very helpful to first lightly block in areas, which is what I'm doing now. As more areas get blocked in, then I start to reburn over them to darken them up. If you look at the reference photo, there are a couple of spots of bright reflected light. These spots will be created by leaving them unburned. As the area around them gets darker, they're going to appear white or bright. Make sure to rotate the board as needed to keep the edges of the different reflections crisp and clean. I did a lot of rotating as I was working on the hubcap. I cut most of the rotations out of the video because it gets unpleasant to watch. Those rotations are the reason why my artwork has clearly defined, crisp edges. This upper left area on the hubcap has a pale thin line meandering through it. Create that pale line by burning adjacent to it, or to put it another way, build up the color adjacent to that line or around that line. It would probably be much easier to use a writer nib instead of a shader like I am doing. Take your time while burning in the area. Also, consult with the reference photo often. Every time you consult with the reference photo, there are two things you should do. 1. Lift the nib up and away from the board. And 2. Blot the nib on scrap before you resume burning. Doing both of these things will ensure dark blobs or blotches don't appear on your artwork. Currently, I am blocking in the shapes on the hubcap. I'm not worried about burning them to their final color. That will happen when I start the reburning process. The lower right area on the hubcap is very similar to the upper left, so burn it in the same way. Basically, you are going to avoid burning over the pale line that meanders through this area. Instead, you will burn the areas adjacent to that pale line. A reminder that a writer nib would be much easier to use in this area. I'm not sure why I didn't use one. Apparently, I wanted to make this more challenging than it needed to be. Another thing I want to remind you about is to use a light hand pressure when burning. I can't emphasize this enough. Using a heavy hand pressure causes a lot of problems. Problems like inconsistent color and color fading away quickly. A heavy hand pressure can also cause the nib to deeply sink down into the wood surface. The smaller the nib is, the greater this problem can become. A light hand pressure allows the nib to maintain constant heat, so the burn results are better, easier to replicate, and control the color. Lightly burn around the spots of reflected light. Do not burn crisp lines around the reflected light. Instead, we want soft edges around the reflected light. Afterwards, rub over the area with an eraser to remove any residual graphite. All of the dark areas on my artwork have been blocked in, so now I am reburning over them to get them to their final value. I use the same techniques for the reburning that I used during the blocking in process. I tend to use either uniform strokes or circular motion as my burn methods. I have not increased the heat setting on my burner. Instead, I rely on reburning and slowing down my hand speed to get dark results. Keep in mind that I am just explaining how I did things. That does not mean it's the best way to do things or that you have to do them the exact same way that I did. I would recommend using a writer nib versus a shader along the outer hubcap. It is almost painful watching myself trying to carefully manipulate the shader nib in these small areas. As I look at my artwork next to the reference photo, I can see all sorts of small details that could have been much better if I had used a smaller nib. Another thing I recommend is to take frequent breaks from difficult areas. Either work on a different area of the car, or work on a different project, or stop burning for a bit. This will keep you from getting burned out. Another benefit is that when you return to the difficult area, you will have fresh eyes and you will notice details that you might have missed before. Finally, I'm using a writer nib to work on the small dark lines found on the hubcap. This nib is a micro writer. I do have a video that explains how to transform a standard writer nib into a micro writer nib. A link to that tutorial will be in the video description. I want to point out how I burned the dark line to a tan color when I neared the sun reflection. An arrow was pointing to the spot. Currently, I am doing 3 things. First, I'm reburning over the dark areas to get them to their final value. Second, I'm making the thin pale lines even thinner. I am doing this by burning over a small portion of their outer edges. And third, I'm making sure the pale lines have very crisp edges. I did this artwork a number of years back. As I create this tutorial, I have to watch the video clips and figure out what I originally did. Needless to say, I was surprised to see that I did use a writer nib. Previously, I was willing to cut myself some slack for some of the sloppy details on the hubcap because I thought I had only used a shader. Now I'm a little disappointed in myself. As I work on the dark tan to light brown areas, I am often using open circular motion as my burn method. This darkens the area and creates a little bit of texture. Circular motion means that you're burning a continuous loop of circles. Open circular motion means that you can see the underlying surface on the loops of the circular motion. To put that another way, if you have a circle, the center of the circle is color-free. Whereas closed circular motion means you cannot see the underlying surface on the loops of the circular motion. The center of the circle is solid in color. Make sure the color adjacent to the spots of reflected sunlight get gradually darker the further from the spots you get. Also, make sure that the reflected sunspots are the lightest in color on the hubcap. This is something I did not do a very good job with. I look at my artwork and I see a number of thin pale lines that should be a couple of shades darker than they are because they are the same or very similar in color as the sun reflection spots. That color is much too light for the pale thin lines. At this point, it is just a matter of reburning over areas until they are as dark as you want them. Let's move on to the next chapter, since I don't have anything more to babble about with the hubcap. Here's a close-up comparison of the reference photo and my artwork. The first thing we will do with the front fender is burn a dark line adjacent to the bumper. The line should be very dark brown or black in color. Next, burn along the pattern lines. You can use a shader or a writer nib for this. There is a spot of reflected sunlight on the fender. Burn around the spot until it is light tan in color. I mostly used circular motion for this. Our current goal is to get the pattern lines burned over so we can erase the pencil marks. When working with a dark reference photo, I find it very helpful to alter its brightness. I use a photo editing program and increase either the exposure or the brightness setting. The inset photos show before and after I increased the brightness setting. Depending on the program, instead of brightness, it might be called an exposure setting. Some programs have both options. Increasing either the brightness or the exposure makes it much easier to see the assorted details on the subject. Extend the dark color adjacent to the bumper on the fender. Burn the area to a dark brown or black color that gradually gets lighter in value, approximately 1/4 inch from the bumper. After using uniform strokes to burn a dark band of color adjacent to the bumper, I switched to circular motion to extend that color. The wide dark band of color adjacent to the bumper ensures that the circular motion burn stroke doesn't accidentally stray over onto the bumper. You may have noticed several deep divots or dots embedded on the paper surface. These dots represent small pinpoint spots of reflected light. They were created using an embossing tool. This is the same technique that we used on the tire tread. You have probably noticed that I have used several different shading nibs. This is not something you need to do. I am burning on paper, and when I did this artwork, I did not have a lot of experience with paper. Burning on paper is more difficult than wood, at least I think so. I'm trying out different nibs to see which one works best for me on this project. Throughout this project, I used either circular motion or uniform strokes as my primary burn methods. I can honestly tell you that if you want the car body to look as smooth as possible, then you really need to use uniform strokes. For me, uniform strokes can get a bit boring to use, but it does produce much better uniform color than circular motion. The problem with circular motion is that it is really easy to get blotchy color. So just keep that in mind as you work on your project. I'm not telling you you can't use circular motion. I'm just giving you a warning that if you want the color to be as smooth as possible, you might want to keep your circular motion burn stroke usage to a minimum. Burn in the left and lower portions of the fender. Don't worry about burning the areas to their final color. Right now we're just blocking in the areas to give them a base layer of color. Since we will be reburning over these areas several times to build up the color, you can use uniform strokes or circular motion as your burn method. After you get a base layer of color burned onto the lower and left areas of the fender, then start reburning over those areas to darken them up and get them to their final values. The area above and slightly behind the tire is pretty dark. The color gets lighter in value as you near the downward curve on the fender. That may not be exactly what the reference photo shows, but it is what I did in my artwork. At this point, I am using uniform strokes as my main burn method. I occasionally use circular motion, but when I do, it is along transitions. This would be areas where the color is gradually changing in value, going from a dark color to a slightly lighter color, or vice versa. Since uniform strokes is my main burn method, let's go over some tips that will help you get better results. Tip 1. Burn so that you are pulling the nib down towards yourself. Burning in this direction makes it much easier to control the burn process. Tip 2. Use a light hand pressure. I often think that I sound like a broken record when I keep talking about using a light hand pressure, but your hand pressure has a huge impact on your burn results. Tip 3. Keep your hand pressure constant. Tip 4. Keep your hand speed constant. Combining tips 3 and 4 are very important, and they go hand in hand to maintain a constant color output. Tip 5. Slightly overlap your burn strokes. This will help hide individual burn strokes, making the area look smoother. Tip 6. Reburn. In my experience, reburning not only darkens the area, but it also hides individual burn strokes. Plus, it can be used to even out color. If you have a spot that is light in value compared to the adjacent area, all you need to do is reburn over that spot until it blends in. Tip 7. If possible, burn with the wood grain. For reasons that I do not understand, the nib is more likely to catch or snag when burning against the grain. The smaller the nib is, the more noticeable this can be. I decided to add 2 reflections between the wheel and the bumper. I first scraped over the area where I wanted the reflections to be to lighten that area a bit. I didn't record that step. Then I reburned around the reflections so they would stand out. The last thing I want to cover in this chapter are the unusual reflections. I circled them on the inset photo. I'm using a standard writer nib to create small slivers of reflected light. Most of the slivers are shaped like vertical bars, but the last 2 are horizontal bars. After the slivers of reflected light are in place, use a shader and lightly burn over them. Yes, you can use a writer nib for this. Not sure why I didn't. Now let's work on the right side of the fender. Begin by burning along the pattern line. Keep your pen tip in optimal position so that the outer edge of this area is crisp and clean. Then burn the right side of the fender so that it is similar in color to the left side of the fender. The techniques for burning this side of the fender are the same that we used for the left side. I am using either circular motion or uniform strokes as my burn method. A reminder that if you want the smoothest results, then avoid using circular motion. There are a couple of things to be aware of. First, there is a very thin, pale line along the curve of the fender. An arrow is pointing to this line. This long, pale, thin line should be 3 to 4 shades lighter in value than the rest of the fender. There is also a bright, thin line on the far right of the fender near the grille. This line should be a tan color. Lastly, there is a slight shadow to the right of the long, thin, pale line. Take your time and enjoy the process. When you rush to get a project done, you're more likely to make mistakes and be disappointed with your artwork. I switched to a writer nib and burned around the divots in the area. The divots are these small pinpoints of reflected light. I also used the writer to burn along the numerous reflections of the grille. I will cover the grille reflections in a separate chapter. I also used the writer to define the curved right edge of the fender. If you prefer, you can rotate the board and use a shader instead of a writer. Afterwards, I switched back to a shader and reburned over the area until it was as dark as it needed to be. Since there is nothing new or unique about this, we're going to move on to the next chapter. Burn around the sun's reflection. Keep the edges soft. Make the color get gradually darker the further from the sun's reflection you get. This center area on the fender is a number of shades lighter in value than the edges, so don't try to match the color to the edges. Also, Keep the outer boundaries of the center area crisp and clean. These edges should already be defined since we already burned the left and right sides of the fender. I continue to use either circular motion or uniform strokes as my burn methods. If you look at my artwork, you can see the color is pretty blotchy. There are two main reasons for this problem. First, my use of circular motion. Uniform strokes is really a much better choice. Second, I am often burning so that I am pushing the nib up and away from myself when using the uniform strokes burn method. I should not be doing this. Instead, you should always pull the nib down towards yourself. Doing so will make it much easier to control your hand pressure and hand speed. You want both of these to be constant. That will give you the best results to get smooth, uniform color. Near the top of the fender, there is a parking light. The parking light and its reflection will be covered in a different chapter. Also, the top end of the fender and the wheel covering will be covered in a different chapter. The only unique thing with the upper portion on the center is the pale band of reflected sky. The reference photo shows the pale band as being brighter on the left side and getting gradually darker and narrower as you travel to the right. I didn't do that on my artwork. You can choose to replicate the photo or my artwork. Either way will look great. At this point, all I am doing is reburning over the center portion of the fender until it is as dark as it needs to be. Since there isn't anything new or unique with what I'm doing, we will move on to the next chapter. Use an embossing tool and create deep divots for the pinpoints of reflected light. To make things easy, I created a divot along the top of every single grille reflection line. Afterwards, rub the embossing tool firmly over the grille reflection lines. I did not make these lines as deep as the pinpoints of reflected light. I did that on purpose since the reference photo shows that the lines aren't as bright as the pinpoints. Next, rub over the area with a pencil eraser to remove excess graphite. Use the flat of a shader and burn over the embossed lines. I am primarily using circular motion as my burn method, but I do use some uniform strokes. If your embossed lines are fairly shallow, it might be best to burn around the lines so that you don't lose them. I want to remind you that if you do lose one of your reflected lines, they can be restored by gently scraping them back into existence with a sharp knife. I like to use an X-Acto knife for this. There is a fairly crisp line along the left side of this long chain of reflections. My artwork does not have a very crisp line along the left edge. At some point, I did fix that. My guess is that I rotated the board so that my nib would be in optimal position, and then I created that crisp line. The tall chain of reflections have dark color around them. Make sure the color around these reflections matches the color found on the right and bottom portion of the fender. I did find it very helpful to use a writer nib and burn dark lines between the reflected grille lines. This really helped make those reflected lines stand out. Now it is just a matter of reburning over the area until the color is as dark as needed. As you reburn over the area, make sure that the pinpoints of reflected light are brighter than the rest of the grille reflection. I am reburning over the grille reflection lines, but I'm avoiding the pinpoint reflections at the top of the lines. Since I don't have anything more to say about this area, and there's nothing different or unique with the reburning process. Let's move on to the next chapter. The top part of the fender is mostly dark in color. There is a thin band of lighter color along the outer edge of the fender. An arrow is pointing to it. Plus there is a spot of reflected light. And lastly, there is the reflection from the metal trim on the wheel cover. This reflection is brightest near the wheel cover and gets gradually lighter and narrower in width. Let's begin by burning a base color over the area. Avoid the reflected light areas. Also, work carefully around the parking light. As I mentioned before, I will cover the parking light and its reflection in a separate chapter. As I burn in the area, I am creating the thin band of light color. This is done by burning a darker color adjacent to where I want that thin band to be. Keep in mind that the thin band is not bright white in color, so make sure to burn over the thin band. Make the thin band several shades lighter in color than the adjacent area. Rotate the board so your nib is in optimal position and burn along the edge of the dark reflection. Burning in this direction will create a nice, clean, crisp edge. Also, make sure to rotate the board in whatever direction you need to create a crisp edge along both sides of the trim reflection. Most likely you are right-handed and will need a different direction than what I would need since I'm left-handed. The metal trim on the wheel cover also needs crisp edges, so burn along the outer edges of the trim with your nib in optimal position so that you can create those crisp edges. Now that the dark part of the upper fender is burned in, I'm fine-tuning the thin pale band of color along the upper edge. Mostly I am making the band thinner, but in some areas I burn over it to darken it up a bit more. Burn the wheel cover to a medium brown color, but avoid the metal trim. Also, make the color lighter in tonal value near the reflection. I circled the area on the inset photo. There are a number of shadows and reflections on the wheel cover, but I kept things simple and ignored most of them. The only details I kept were the two large reflections. The first is found on the trim, and the other is found to the right of it. Again, I marked them on the reference photo. I am using Colwood's MR nib. It's also called a rounded heel, or a skew. This type of nib is great for burning really thin lines. A word of warning, skews have a very narrow edge, and this edge can dig deeply into the wood surface, so make sure you use a light hand pressure when using one. Now it is a matter of reburning over the area until the color is as dark as you need or want. Make sure to burn over the reflected trim. Examine the reference photo and notice how the color on the reflection is brightest where it's closest to the wheel cover and gets gradually darker in value as you move away from the wheel cover. I burned semi-gradient color on both ends of the wheel cover. The color is lightest in value near the reflection and gets slightly darker as you travel away from the reflection. This isn't exactly what the reference photo shows, but I think what I did looks decent. Remember to rotate the board as needed to make burning easier. I often cut out the times I'm rotating the board because it can make viewing unpleasant. Just be aware that I do rotate the board, and so should you. Since I am in reminder mode, this is a reminder to make sure and use a light hand pressure when burning. A heavy hand pressure creates a lot of problems. If there is just one thing you take away from my tutorial, using a light hand pressure would be it. This will fix a lot of problems and make it so much easier to get consistent, repeatable, smooth burn results. Burn in the dark portion of the reflection. The color should match the sides of the fender. Be aware that later on I reburn over the reflection to get it to its final color, but I won't be showing that in this video. Next, burn in the parking light base. This is in shadows, so burn it to a dark brown or black color. Make sure to leave a gap between the base and the reflection. This gap is the portion of the parking lot base that isn't in shadows. Block in the area above the metal trim on the parking light. The left side of the light is reflecting some distant trees, so it has an irregular edge to it. There is a pinpoint of reflected light near the right edge. I used an embossing tool to create a deep divot for that spot. I didn't record that step since I've shown that technique several times already in this video. Along the top center of the parking light, we see reflected sky, so the color is lighter in value than the edges. This is the same thing we saw on the fender. That means that the center of the parking light should be similar in color to the center of the fender. I should mention that the front or the white portion of the parking light will be explained after I'm done with the parking light housing. Most of the housing is blocked in, so now I am reburning to darken it to its final value. Uniform strokes is my primary burn method that I use, but occasionally I do use some circular motion. Some of the details on the Buick are pretty small, so if it's easier, use a writer nib instead of a shader to burn them in. Make sure to lightly burn over the gap between the base and the reflection. Also lightly burn over the metal trim. Use a writer nib and burn a dark line between the metal trim on the housing. Repeat this on the front portion of the reflection. Then, if needed, darken up the metal trim. Since the trim is not in direct sunlight, it's not very bright. With the reflection, I burned open circular motion over it to darken and give it some irregular texture. I've reduced the brightness on the reference photo so that it is easier to see the details on the white portion of the parking light. There is a ring that connects the white portion of the light to the metal. Adjacent to that ring is a dark tan line. Burn in that line using a writer nib. The line is also on the reflection. To help the reflection stand out, I did not extend the line all the way to the edges. I did burn over the entire reflection, and that's because the reflection is not as bright as the actual parking light. Also, I darkened a triangular shape on the reflection that does not extend to the edges. Again, this is to help the white portion stand out. A very important part of making the white portion of the light stand out is burning the adjacent area to a darker color. I would recommend not burning in the parking light until you have the fender burned in. With the white portion of the parking light, I did almost the opposite of what I did with the reflection. I left a quasi-triangular shape lighter in color instead of darker. I did keep the outer edges lighter in color since that is what the reference photo shows, and it helps the white portion stand out from the background. The last thing I did was use a writer nib and reburn over the darker areas. Here is a comparison of my artwork and the reference photo. I did not create an exact replica, but that's okay. It still looks good. I simplified the grill on my artwork by burning each bar on the grill to the same color. That does not mean you have to do the same thing. If you prefer, before you burn a grill bar, consult with the reference photo and mimic what you see. Either way is going to look great. It's just a matter of how much time and effort you want to spend on this. Something that I highly recommend you do is burn in the dark metal between each bright bar of the grill as you work your way up or down the grill. The color does not need to be to its final value. The purpose is just to make it easy to tell the bright grill bars apart from the dark metal. For some reason, I find it easier to burn straight lines using a shader versus a writer nib. I'm not sure why this is. Maybe it's because there's more metal in contact with the board when I'm using a shader. I only use a shader for straight lines when the width of the line doesn't matter. To make sure that my grill edges were straight, I used a ruler and drew a line along both of the outer edges of the grill. After the guideline was drawn in, I used a shader to burn along that line. When you do this, make sure your nib is in optimal position so that the grill has a crisp, clean edge. Optimal position means that the front edge of the nib is on the line and the body of the nib is angled over the dark metal on the car. The body of the nib should not be angled over the grill. Burn in the dark metal between the bright bars on the grill. I'm currently using a writer nib for this because the small nib makes it easier to avoid burning over the fender accent. Make sure to burn carefully around the Buick logo. If you have a micro writer, I would recommend using that nib when burning around the letters, especially if your artwork is on the smaller side like mine is. Is the Buick logo essential? No. If you prefer, leave it out. That would make the grill much easier to burn in. I doubt anyone would notice the lack of a logo, unless that person was an old car enthusiast. After the dark metal between the grill bars has been burned in, then burn the dark metal between the grill and the center trim. I have no idea if the center trim has a specific name, so I'm just going with center trim. An arrow is pointing to the trim on the reference photo that I'm referring to. Make sure you keep your nib in optimal position when burning along the trim and the grill. You want the edges of both to be crisp and clean. I am using uniform strokes as my burn method. I'm not burning at a high heat. Instead, I have my burner set to produce a medium to dark tan burn result. To get a dark brown or black color, I re-burn over an area. Another way I get a darker result is by slowing down my hand speed. I very seldom adjust the heat setting on my burner. I tend to bounce around the artwork. This means I might be working on a dark area 1 minute and then I switch to a lighter area. I don't want to have to worry about remembering to turn down the heat setting when I go to that lighter color. By keeping my burner set to produce a medium to dark tan color, I can bounce around between light and dark areas all I want to. After all of the dark metal around the grill has been burned in, then burn the right edge of the grill to a tan color. This edge curves inward, so it's slightly darker. Immediately to the left of that right edge is a column of bright reflection. This reflection is created by not burning over it. If you do burn over the reflection, you can restore it by scraping away the color. Or you can burn the rest of the grill so that it is slightly darker than the reflection. There is also a column of reflection along the left edge of the grill, so avoid burning over that area. Otherwise, burn over all the bars on the grille, but avoid burning over the Buick logo, assuming, of course, that you're incorporating the logo into your artwork. If you aren't, you don't have to worry about that. Do not worry about burning the grille to a perfectly uniform color. As long as the color variation is minimal, no one is going to notice. I don't have anything more to say about the grille, so let's move on to the Buick logo, assuming you're including it. The first thing to do is use a writer nib, preferably a micro writer, and make sure that the grille around the logo is burned in. Afterwards, burn in the portion of the grille that shows between the loops on some of the letters. Take your time and work carefully with this. Next, carefully burn the center of each letter dark, leaving the outer edges of the letters unburned. If needed, use the tip of a sharp knife to restore any highlights you've lost. I'm currently creating the highlights that you see gently curving near the left edge of the grille. I could not find the video clips for the center trim. The best I can do for you is this close-up of the reference photo and my artwork. Here is a comparison of the reference photo and my artwork. Rotate the board so your pen is in optimal position and burn adjacent to the metal trim the arrow is pointing to on the reference photo. If you are right-handed, you will need the board rotated in the opposite direction than what I have. Afterwards, burn along the edge of the reflection that is a short distance from the trim. Again, an arrow is pointing to that spot. I would recommend burning along all edges that need to be crisp. That said, only burn the edges that you can while your pen is in optimal position. If your pen is not in optimal position, don't burn the edge. Rotate the board and repeat the process of burning lines along edges that need to be crisp that can be done while your nib is in optimal position in this direction. After that is done, start blocking in the hood. I am using an assortment of burn strokes. I can see I'm using uniform strokes, circular motion, and a zigzag type of burn. The zigzag is just a back and forth motion using the flat of the shader so that it looks solid instead of a lot of individual lines. Of the 3 burn strokes, uniform strokes is my primary burn method. As I mentioned before, uniform strokes will give you the smoothest burn results. I'm starting with the left side of the hood because it is less complicated than the right. Also, I'm blocking in the darker areas first. Other than the trim and a couple of reflections, I have arrows pointing at them. There isn't anything unique with the left side of the hood. I'm avoiding burning over them until I have the darker areas done. Notice the uneven color I just burned in. This happened because I pushed the nib up and away instead of pulling it down towards myself. Don't make the same stupid mistake that I did. Always pull the nib down towards yourself. The reason for this is that pulling the nib down gives you much better control over your hand pressure and hand speed. You are able to keep them constant. And that is a lot harder to do when you're pushing up and away. When you burn in the different sections or shapes on the hood, make sure the final color is the same color or darker than the pattern lines that were burned along the outer edges of the shapes. An arrow is pointing to one of the lines I'm referring to. If your line was burned darker than it should be, just use the tip of a sharp knife to gently scrape away some of the color. There are a number of reflections on the upper left side of the hood. I carefully burned around them with the shader, but afterwards I like to use a writer nib and fine-tune those reflections. I also use the writer nib in small areas that are difficult to burn in with the shader. None of the reflections on the upper left side are bright white, so make sure to burn over them to tone down their brightness. For this I am using a shader and burning uniform strokes until the color is as dark as I think it should be. The top center panel on the hood is pale in color, especially compared to the darker adjacent areas. The center panel has a uniform pale color to it, but the adjacent panel to the left does not. The adjacent panel starts out pale, but gets gradually darker as you approach the left side of the hood. As I look at my artwork, I can tell you that I did not burn the hood as dark as it should be, especially the far left side of it. The bright reflection on the front edge of the hood is created by not burning over it. Or to put it another way, the reflection is created by burning over the area adjacent to the reflection. Now I have some bad news to tell you. I do not have the video files for the right side of the hood accent, or the metal trim on the left side. I'm not sure how that happened. In fact, this clip here is the last of the hood video files I have. Regardless, there isn't anything overly complicated with the aforementioned items. Just take your time and consult with the reference photo often. Here is a comparison of my artwork and the reference photo. The side panel on the car isn't remarkable other than the trim. The dark portion of it should be burned to a uniform medium to dark brown color. I had originally burned the area to an almost black color, but I later decided I didn't like that really dark color. At some point, I gently scraped over the area to reduce the color, and that's a lot of the reason why this area on my artwork looks super blotchy. Paper doesn't behave like wood does, and removing color from the paper generally doesn't go well. Since there isn't anything unique or special with the dark area of the car side, let's skip ahead to the trim. I started out using a shader to burn along the outer edges of the trim. That works okay. I did this artwork before I experimented around with different ways to create straight lines. If I were to do this again, I would use one of those techniques so that the lines would be much straighter than they are. I will put a link to that video on straight lines in the video description. I switched to a skew tip and rotated the board so I was pulling the nib down towards myself. This worked better for me. I only point this out because there is often more than one way to do things. Sometimes you have to experiment to find out what works best for you. I'm using a writer nib to block in the dark areas between the trim. I'm not burning the dark areas to their final color. Instead, I just want to make it easier to differentiate between the dark metal and the trim. After that was done, I made sure this line adjacent to the headlight casing had crisp edges. By the way, rotate the board as needed instead of positioning your hand in weird angles as you burn around this line. Lastly, lightly burn over the trim, but leave the right edge several shades lighter in value. The color on the trim does not need to be uniform in tonal value, especially since the color is not uniform on the reference photo. Here's a close-up comparison of the reference photo and my artwork. Let's start with the headlight housing that is below the metal trim. Burn a dark line adjacent to the metal trim. Make sure the metal trim edge is crisp and clean. Then burn the lower housing to a medium brown color. The reference photo has been brightened up to better see the details. Looking at the reference photo, we can see there is a cast shadow under the metal housing. That cast shadow should be dark brown to black in color. The metal housing has a rounded cone shape, or maybe a better term would be an American football shape. Burn the housing to a medium brown color, but allow the color to get gradually darker as you near the back of the housing. When I started burning this area, I didn't really notice the cast shadow, so I burned everything to a medium brown color. Eventually, I did fix that and created the cast shadow. I continued to use an assortment of burn strokes instead of sticking with uniform strokes, like I should. That is a major reason why my artwork looks blotchy. The closer you look at it, the blotchier it appears. I highly recommend only using uniform strokes as your burn method if you want the car to look really nice and smooth. Since there isn't anything unique or unusual with the lower half of the headlight housing, let's move on to the next section. Use a rider nib or a skew pin tip and burn along the edges of the trim. Rotate the board as needed so that you are pulling the nib down towards yourself. If I haven't said this before, nib and pin tip are the same thing. Then use a rider nib and burn a dark line along the outer edge of the housing. Also burn a dark line adjacent to the metal ring along the front of the housing. Rotate the board as needed to make the process easier. I did avoid the left side of the metal ring since it has a number of reflections. I circled the area on the reference photo. Next, use the shader of your choice and block in the upper part of the metal housing. Like usual, I started with the darker areas first. The dark areas are reflections of nearby buildings and things of that sort. I chose to soften the upper edge of those reflections so that they seemed more like trees. Also, I burned these dark reflections to a fairly uniform color. It is completely up to you if you want to do the same or mimic the reference photo. I did keep 2 spots of reflected light on the upper housing. The first spot is this pale bar adjacent to the metal ring. An arrow is pointing to it. The second spot is a pinpoint of light by the trim. Again, an arrow is pointing to the area. You probably noticed I changed pin tips. There isn't a project-specific reason for this. Often I will work on a number of projects each day. When I switch between projects, I usually keep the same nib I was using on the previous project. I point this out because I don't want you to think you need to use a lot of different pin tips. You don't. One shader, one rider nib, and one skew will get you through this project. I highly recommend rotating the board so your pin tip is in optimal position when burning along the upper edge of the trim. This will help ensure that the trim has crisp, clean edges. Then extend the color to darken the area while the board is rotated. This will make it much easier to avoid burning over the trim. Looking at the video, I can tell that I used an embossing tool to create the divot where the pinpoint of reflected light next to the trim is. I didn't bother wasting video time showing you this since I have covered that easy-to-do technique in previous chapters. At this point, it is just a matter of reburning over the housing until it is as dark as you want it to be. Since that is a straightforward process, and I have nothing new to add, let's move on to the trim. Use a rider nib and burn a line between each bar on the trim. There are 3 bars. Take your time and use a light hand pressure when burning. Don't burn at a high heat. It is better to reburn and build up the color, especially since we want the trim to have crisp edges. Then carefully burn around the right edge of the trim. Afterwards, switch to a shader and burn over the trim. Burn it to a tan color. Leave the right edge a few shades lighter in value than the rest of the trim. Like most of the trim on this car, the color does not need to be uniform in tonal value. If you look at the reference photo, you can see that there is some tonal variety on the trim. I did switch to a micro rider to finish the trim, mostly because it allowed me to burn around the right edge of the trim with precision. I am going to end this chapter because that is all I can think of to say about the metal housing. Let's move on to the next chapter, which is the metal ring. Use a rider nib and burn along the edges of the dark reflections on the left side of the metal ring. Burn a dark line along the left edge of the ring. Afterwards, begin blocking in the dark reflections on the ring. Avoid burning over any of the pale reflections. I like to burn around the edges of a pale reflection before I block in an area. This makes them easier to see and avoid. If you have a small enough shader, you can use that instead of a rider nib. The most important thing is to use what feels comfortable for you and what you find works the best for you. As I watch this video, I can see that I never burned in the dark line along the edge of the rim that's found below the trim. An arrow is pointing to the area. Obviously, it is not a big deal if you leave it out. After all, until now, I didn't notice that my artwork was lacking it. As you work on the dark reflections, make sure the color is similar to the metal housing. It would be better for the metal ring to be lighter versus darker than the metal housing. The reason for that is we want the metal ring to be easily differentiated from the metal housing. A lighter tonal value will help it do that. There is a bright circle of reflected light on the upper left side of the ring. There are some rays of light extending out from that circle. I did not incorporate the rays of light into my artwork, but that doesn't mean you can't. The edges of the reflected light should be soft, and this includes the rays of light. I would have to say that the edges on my artwork are fairly crisp. I did a poor job with the reflected light. One other thing I want to mention, which I have said in previous chapters, but I'm going to repeat it again, the bright circle of reflected light is created by not burning over it. To put that another way, the bright circle of reflected light is created by burning the area adjacent to that bright light. At this point, I am mostly reburning to get the ring to its final tonal value. This isn't very exciting or informative. Before I end this chapter, I do want to cover the grille reflections that are found along the upper right side of the ring. To create the pinpoints of reflected light, I used a micro rider nib and burned small circles. Afterwards, I darkened up the area adjacent to the circles. This increased the contrast so that the circles appeared pale in color compared to the darker color adjacent to them. With that explained, let's move on to the next chapter, which is the headlight glass. There is a thin, pale ring that circles the headlight. Burn a line along the inner and outer edge of this ring. Rotate the board as needed to make it easier to do this. Then burn the reflection trace lines found on the headlight to a tan color. I find it helpful to very lightly burn in some of the reflection shapes to make it easier to match things with the reference photo. For some reason, I recorded these initial steps on the right headlight, but did not record anything after that. I did not record the initial steps with the left headlight, but I recorded all the rest of it. I don't know why. Because of that, we're starting with the right headlight and we'll continue with the left one. The pattern lines on the left headlight have been burned over. Now burn in the dark reflection on the left side of the headlight. Make sure to avoid burning over the pale line that runs through the center of the headlight. Then start blocking in the shapes on the headlight. Keep the color in the light to medium tan range. The pale color will make it easier to create the grid lines that are found on the glass. You can use whatever burn stroke you like for this. I tend to use either uniform strokes or circular motion as my burn method. The color does not need to be uniform in tonal value. Instead, it just needs to be on the paler side. The headlights are an area where you really should take your time and consult with the reference photo often, especially in the beginning. While it is not necessary to capture every detail on the headlight, you do want to capture enough details so that the headlight looks fairly realistic. If you look at my artwork, you can see that I did not replicate all of the grid lines. Instead, I captured around half of them, and that was enough for realism. When I block in an object, I always look for the lightest and the darkest value. The lightest value is in the center. This I assigned a value of white. White means that it's unburned. The darkest value is this area along the left side. That got assigned a dark brown, maybe a blackish color. After the lightest and darkest are determined, then I know all the other shapes on the headlight have to be darker than the center bright area, but lighter than that left spot. Before I burn in a shape, I look at the reference photo and determine its total value. For example, to the left of the bright spot is a shape that is a dark tan color. To the left of it is a shape that is in the light tan range. If we go to the right of that bright spot, we have a band that is the same tonal value as the shape to the left of the bright spot. To the right of that is a shape that is in the light to medium brown range. Looking at my artwork, I can see that I kept it in the tan range, but I really should have burned it a few shades darker. Most of the darker areas on my headlight have been blocked in. Now I am working on the lighter areas. As needed, I reburn over the darker shapes to make sure that they remain darker compared to the rest of the headlight. Because there are a number of shapes that have different tonal values, I am working slow and consulting with the reference photo often. There is one major goal with the headlight. That goal is to burn the headlight dark enough so that the bright center shape looks pale. On the flip side, the overall color of the headlight should be considerably lighter in value than the metal. This is to ensure that the headlight really stands out, since it is part of the focal point on this artwork. As I reburn over the headlight, I pay careful attention to the light and dark areas on the headlight. Obviously, I reburn over the darker areas more times than the lighter ones. Since the headlight is so small, I'm using my smallest shader for this. If you don't have a really small shader, you can use a writer nib instead. In fact, it might be easier to use a writer nib. Mostly, I am using uniform strokes as my burn method, but occasionally I do use some circular motion. Again, a reminder to use a light hand pressure when burning. A light hand pressure produces better results than a heavy one does. I am almost done burning the base or foundation of the headlight. I want to point out that the overall color is not very dark and the color is not uniform in value. This will help with the next step of adding lines. Before we do that, let's fine-tune a few things. Use either a micro writer or a standard writer and burn a line along the inner edge of the ring that is between the headlight and the metal ring. If needed, darken up the dark reflection along the left side of the headlight. I also thinned out the pale line running between the reflection. After that is done, burn some vertical, thin, medium tan lines that follow the contours of the headlight. This means that the lines should have a curve to them. Also, do your best to keep the lines evenly spaced apart. If it helps, draw in the lines with a pencil first. I do want to point out that some of my vertical lines are not continuous. Maybe a better phrasing is that some of the lines do not extend all the way across the headlight surface. This helps replicate the way the light is interacting on the gridded surface of the headlight. After the vertical lines are burned in, then it is time to do the horizontal lines. At first, I mostly worked on further defining some of the shape edges. I also darkened up some of the smaller shapes that were hard to do with the shader. During this process, I am consulting with the reference photo a lot. If you examine the reference photo, hopefully you will notice that very few of the horizontal lines are continuous. Most of the lines are only visible for short distances. I have slowed the video down a lot to show you how I create a pale vertical line. This is done by burning darker on either side of where I want a pale line to be. I do allow this to be semi-random by burning in a short up and down fashion. This fills an area with numerous lines that allows gaps to happen here and there. Some of the gaps I really emphasize by reburning the area adjacent to them darker. The key to this whole technique is to burn at a low heat and to use a very light hand pressure. If you do not like this approach, you can use the tip of a sharp knife and gently scrape the pale lines into existence. Since I'm burning on paper, I avoided that technique because I was afraid of putting a hole in the paper. At this point, the essentials are burned in on my headlight. Now I'm fine-tuning. I compare a small section of my artwork with the reference photo and determine what more needs to be done. Usually, this means I just need to darken up the area so that the bright reflections stand out. Occasionally, I lose one of my grid lines during the darkening up process. To restore the line, I just simply reburn over it. An important step in the fine-tuning process is to move around the artwork. Work for a little bit in one area, then move to a completely different area. This helps keep your eyes fresh so that you can better critique your artwork. It is also a good idea to take breaks from burning. I spent a week or more working for 15 to 20 minutes at a time. I sure as heck did not complete the headlight in one sitting. It may take you less or more time to do your own headlight. Keep in mind, this isn't a competition. The most important thing to do is take your time. Rushing to get a project done seldom produces good results. This is another reminder to burn at a low heat and to use a light hand pressure. Yes, I am repeating myself and babbling a little bit. My apologies for that. I'm trying to show all of the video clips in their entirety for the headlight. I figured that the headlight was the most complex item on the Ford Buick and would be the thing people wanted to see the most. The problem I'm having is trying to think of new things to say. Fortunately, I'm nearing the end of the video clips. As I look at my artwork, I can see some things I wish I had done differently. For example, I missed the small spot of reflected light on the ring that is opposite of the large one. Also, the right side of my ring is too bright. The good thing is that no one else, except you, knows this. Also, no one is going to look at the artwork that closely. This applies to your artwork too, so don't obsess about making a perfect replica of the reference photo. Just do your best. Here's a close-up of the reference photo and my artwork. The last thing to cover is the background. I started by using a shader and burning a layer of circular motion over the background. I did not try to make the color uniform since I figured any tonal variety would help with the road texture. After the circular motion layer was burned in, I used a writer nib and stippled over the ground. Stippling means you are burning dots. In this case, lots of dots. It is not necessary to keep the dots uniform in size or color. Here is how my final artwork looks. Well, that is it for this tutorial. I hope you found the information useful, and I hope I covered everything that you were interested in. Like I said at the beginning, the reference photo and the pattern are available on my Etsy page, and a link to that will be in the video description. Well, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you soon.